They stopped calling me Kale in the 3rd year of the war. After that, I was 7th rank ward, a designation stamped on a vial schedule. And the compound in that vial was the only reason my heart kept its rhythm, instead of tearing itself apart trying to do what they'd built it to do. The augmentation had won us 4 battles and 1 armistice. Then the armistice held, the war ended, and somewhere in a budget hall I never saw, a council clerk drew a red line through the cost of my medication and called it legacy overhead. They moved me to the decommission wing of the Ilvara Spire 2 days later. Nobody used the word kill, they used the word taper. A gentle word for what happens when you take a body built to burn hot and slowly starve it of the one thing keeping the fire inside its walls. 5 physicians tried the taper on me, in 5 separate weeks, each one certain their schedule would succeed where the last had failed. The first was young and confident and read me statistics from a data slate the whole time, as if the numbers themselves were meant to be comforting. The second barely spoke to me at all, only to the instruments. The third apologized before every measurement, which was somehow worse than not apologizing. Each time my pulse spiked past anything their instruments were built to read, and each time they stopped the taper and logged it as a failure of the compound rather than a failure of the plan. Nobody asked what else had changed in the room besides the dosage. Nobody asked because nobody thought to look at me as anything other than the dosage. By the 5th failure, the reports had stopped bothering to include my name at all, only the designation, as if the name had already been decommissioned first. The custodian came at the same hour every night, long after the physicians had gone home to write their reports. I heard the cart before I saw him, a wheel that needed oil, a bucket that needed less water in it, the particular scrape of a mop dragged rather than pushed. The first week he didn't speak to me at all. He wasn't cleared to. Custodial staff were barred from the decommission cells. I found out later he'd been told that twice, and had signed a form both times acknowledging the restriction, and then kept coming anyway, mopping the corridor outside my cell instead of the one he'd been assigned. Because the schedule, he said, worked out better that way. His name was Desmond Alcaraz. He was human, which in the Spire meant less than nothing, lower than custodial, if such a rank existed. He had gray coming in at his temples and a limp he never explained, and he talked to the mop bucket the way some men talk to themselves, low and constant, about nothing in particular. The weather in some province I'd never heard of. A daughter who wrote letters and never mentioned a husband. The correct way to get grout out of a stone floor without ruining the stone. I did not answer him for 11 nights. On the 12th, he asked if the light bothered me, and I said yes, and he came back the next night with a cloth to dim the overhead panel, and that was the whole of it. No ceremony, no physician in the room writing down that a threshold had been crossed. He never once asked what I was rated for, or how many the augmentation had killed, or whether the stories about the 7th rank were true. He asked whether I preferred the cell warmer or cooler, and whether the bread they brought me was any good, and once, on a night when the physicians had left in a temper, whether I wanted the light off entirely or just dimmed. Small questions. The kind you'd ask any man doing time in an ordinary room, not a weapon waiting for its schedule. By the 4th week I noticed I was waiting for the cartwheel. I did not tell the physicians this. I am not certain I understood it myself, not as anything worth reporting. But the readings on my chart, which I saw upside down through the observation glass whenever a nurse forgot to angle it away, began to show something the taper schedules never had. Long stretches, always between the hour the custodian arrived and the hour he left, where the surges simply did not come. I thought it was coincidence. So apparently, did everyone with a medical degree, right up until the 6th physician noticed the pattern crossed 3 separate taper attempts and could not be explained by dosage curves alone. The council did not care for that explanation. A weapon that stabilized because a stranger talked to it about grout was not a weapon anyone could budget for. They set a final date, full withdrawal, supervised, with an armed detail present in case the theory failed and I became what 5 other reports insisted I would become. Desmond was informed his corridor assignment had been reassigned effective that morning, a courtesy, someone called it, so he wouldn't have to watch. He came anyway. I heard the cartwheel at the wrong hour, hours before his shift, and I heard the argument at the outer door, his voice, flat and unhurried, telling the detail captain that he had a floor to finish, and the floor was on the other side of that door, and if they meant to stop him they could write it up as insubordination, and he'd sign that form too. They let him through, I think, mostly, because nobody wanted to be the one who explained to the council why they'd needed to physically remove a 50-year-old man with a mop from a decommission cell. He didn't hold my hand the way the stories about that sort of thing always claim. He set his bucket down where he always set it, and sat on the low stool where he always sat, and he kept talking about the daughter, about a letter that had arrived that week saying she'd finally fixed the leak under her kitchen sink herself instead of paying someone, and how proud that had made him, prouder than he expected, over a sink. The withdrawal began. The armed detail watched their instruments. My pulse climbed the way it always climbed, and then, the physicians confirmed this later, from the recordings. It climbed exactly to the edge of where it always broke, and stopped there, and held, for the 11 minutes it took the compound to clear my blood entirely. Because Desmond kept talking about a sink, and I kept listening, and neither one of us stopped. There is no elegant law of medicine in that. The sixth physician tried for a week afterward to write one down and gave up in the end, and simply wrote what she'd seen, that whatever the augmentation required to burn without consuming itself, it was not only chemical. Some part of it, unmeasured until Desmond found it by accident, was the plain fact of being spoken to like a man doing an ordinary thing, instead of a liability being managed. The council, faced with a live weapon that no longer required funding, reversed the order within a day. There was talk of restoring my rank, my quarters, my old wing with its view of the parade ground. There was talk, too, of promoting Desmond out of the custodial ranks entirely, a staff physician's badge, they said, for a man who'd apparently outdiagnosed 5 of them. He turned it down, told the board, in the same flat voice he'd used on the detail captain, that he had a floor to finish and didn't see what a badge would do for the grout. Someone on the board pressed him, asked if he understood what he was refusing: a physician's pension, a physician's quarters, a name on a door instead of a route on a schedule. He said he understood it fine, and that he'd had a route on a schedule for 30 years and had never once needed a name on a door to know where he belonged. He kept his cart, his bucket, his corridor. He only asked that the assignment sheet stop pretending my cell wasn't on his route. I turned my own reinstatement down 2 days later, which surprised the council more than it should have. I told them the parade ground had never once asked whether I was thirsty, or whether the light was too bright, or how a daughter I'd never met had fixed a sink on her own. I asked instead to be assigned to facilities maintenance, under Desmond, for as long as he'd have me. It took him 3 tries to teach me how to wring a mop properly instead of drowning it, and he laughed at me the whole time, in a way no physician ever had, and no council report will ever explain why that mattered more to me than any medal. I still hear the cartwheel most mornings. It still needs oil. I have offered, more than once, to fix it. He tells me every time that a wheel with a little complaint left in it is easier to hear coming, and that a man in my former line of work ought to appreciate a little advance warning. I have started to agree with him.